Hi, this is a video to help you through the activity on molecular shape. When we're talking about molecular shape, we're going to be using valence shell electron repulsion theory, or VSEPR. Valence shell electron repulsion theory is just a theory that says that electron pairs want to get as far away from each other as possible. And this makes sense if you think about electron pairs as the negative end, or the north pole of a magnet. When you bring two of the same poles of a magnet together, they repel each other. And clouds of electrons that all have the same charge, negatively charged density basically, they repel each other. And so these electron pairs, when they're attached to an atom, want to get as far away from each other as possible. For the rest of this discussion, I'm going to be talking about electron groups. And groups are pairs of electrons that are either in bonds or they're non-bonded pairs. So anytime I'm talking about electron groups, I'm talking about either bonds or lone pairs of electrons. A really nice way to organize this information is in a table. I'm going to write the same table that you have in your activity. I'm going to start talking about the number of groups. So the total number of groups is going to be made up of the number of bonds plus the number of lone pairs. I'm going to start at the highest number, 4. Anytime I have 4 different groups of electrons around any one atom, it's going to have a tetrahedral geometry. Let me show you what I mean. Balloons are a really nice model for electron clouds. If you imagine that there's an atom at the very center of where these balloons are connected, and that the balloons are representing electron groups, this is a really good model for what an atom looks like when there are 4 groups around it. Notice that this shape is not flat, it's actually a 3-dimensional shape. And this is the shape we call a tetrahedron. It's a good idea if you can build one of these models, either with balloons or with a molecular modeling kit, so that you can see how a tetrahedron is shaped. Okay, so this is the model for our atom. And anytime we have 4 groups around a central atom, those 4 groups try to be as far apart from each other as possible. And the farthest they can be apart from each other is 109 degrees away from each other. Okay, let's talk about this. There are 4 groups. So we have an atom, and there are 4 groups around it. It's in the shape of a tetrahedron. Now, when all 4 of those groups are bonds, and that means there are 0 lone pairs, this means that the shape of the whole molecule is tetrahedral. Now, I want to talk about 2 types of shape, electronic shape and molecular shape. The electronic shape is essentially the shape that you would see if all of the atoms were invisible and you could just see the electrons. So basically, if you can imagine that there's an atom at the center of this, and then each of these electron pairs is actually a bond. We draw bonded electrons as lines, but they really do take up space. So kind of squint your eyes and pretend like you can't see any of the atoms, but you can just see the electron clouds. And it would look just like this arrangement of balloons. That is what we know as the electronic geometry. And the electronic geometry, when there are 4 groups and 4 of them are bonds, is a tetrahedron. Or we say it has a tetrahedral shape. And when all of the groups are bonds, the molecular shape is the same. And now I'll give you an example. So an example of a molecule that has 4 groups around the central atom, and all 4 of those groups are bonds, is CH4. So we'll build a model of CH4 later and see its shape is tetrahedral. I forgot to mention that when you have a tetrahedral electronic geometry, if it's a perfect tetrahedron, your bond angles are exactly 109.5 degrees. Okay, now let's talk about when you have 4 groups, but only 3 of them are bonds, and one of these things is a lone pair. So if you have 4 groups and 3 of them are bonds, that means you have 1 lone pair. Now, this would be the situation where, once again, you have 4 electronic groups, but now this, let's say the pink balloon is a lone pair, and the other, at the very tips of the other balloons, you have atoms. So you have an atom in the center and atoms at the very tips of the balloons. But this guy is still taking up space. Now, it looks like my pink balloon is deflating. No. This guy is still taking up space, and so it pushes these three groups down away from the plane where this central atom is. So if you kind of squint your eyes and imagine that you can see the center atom here and the atoms that are at the tips of the balloons, hopefully you can see that you would have a trigonal pyramid-shaped molecule. So I'll draw a picture of what this would look like. So you have an atom here, and then you have a lone pair of electrons. Okay? You'd still have all the other groups. And so basically, your electronic geometry here remains tetrahedral. But your molecular geometry changes. So basically, your electronic geometry hasn't changed very much at all. It still looks the same. But the difference is now when you squint your eyes, you don't see the balloon on the top. You only see the balloons that are on the bottom. And this leaves you with a trigonal pyramid-shaped molecule. The difference between the electronic shape and the molecular shape is when we're talking about electronic shape, we're only talking about the electrons and where they are. And the molecular shape is basically the shape that the atoms would make. So these are different, especially when you have lone pairs. An example of this kind of a molecule is NH3. The nitrogen has one lone pair and 3 bonded groups. In this case, the lone pair actually takes up a bit more space. So let's look at my balloons again. So the lone pair on top actually takes up a bit more space than the other pairs because when they're non-bonded pairs, they're kind of unbridled and taking up more space than the other electrons that are contained in a bond. And so they actually push the atoms or the bonds closer together. And so for this, we just say that it's slightly less than 109.5 degrees. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about a situation where you have 4 groups, 2 of them are bonds, and 2 of them are lone pairs. In this case, once again, you're going to have the 2 lone pairs taking up more space than the bonded groups. So if we imagine that the pink and the orange balloons are taking up more space, they would be pushing the 2 atoms on the red and the yellow balloon closer together. And so then once again, the bond angle is just less than 109.5. And this one would be less than this one, but we don't split hairs that far. So we'll just call them less than 109.5. If you have 4 groups, you still have a tetrahedral electronic geometry, but now your molecular shape is different once again. So let's use this as an example. So if you can imagine that the pink and the orange balloon are lone pairs of electrons, there's an atom in the middle, very center, and there's an atom here and here. The shape we would see if we could not see the electrons and we could only see the atoms would be the molecular shape. And this shape we call bent. An example would be water. If I drew my cartoon, it might look something like this. I'll put the lone pairs down here, and I'll put my bonded groups here and here. All right, so that's pretty much what you have if you have 4 groups. Remember, groups are bonds and lone pairs, and depending on the ratio between the bonds and the lone pairs, you will have different molecular shapes. But anytime you have 4 groups around a central atom, the electronic geometry will also always be tetrahedral. Now let's move on to a different category. Let's talk about when you have 3 different groups. So I'm going to modify my model here. And I'm going to get rid of my pink balloon, which is deflating. And let's look at a shape that would occur if 3 things were attached to one central atom. Once again, they'll try to get as far away from each other as they can. but now they're kind of a flat shape. This is what we call a trigonal plane. It's planar, like in the plane of the board right now, or now in this plane. So it's trigonal because there's 3 spokes, and it's planar because it's in a plane. So anytime you have 3 groups, you're going to have a trigonal planar electronic geometry. So I'll draw a picture again. That now this is flat. So if I had 3 groups, 1, 2, 3, and the electron clouds would be like that. When we have 3 bonds and 0 lone pairs, we know that our electronic shape is trigonal planar, and our molecular shape is also trigonal planar. An example of this would be a molecule. Let's say we had a double bond to another nitrogen. Here, each of these nitrogens is trigonal planar because it has 3 total groups around it. It has this cloud of electrons, that's the double bond, it has this cloud of electrons between the hydrogen and the nitrogen, and this cloud of electrons. So each one of those nitrogens is trigonal planar. And when we have a trigonal planar molecule, we can figure out its bond angle because it's just 360 degrees divided by 3. So it's 120 degrees. Okay. So now what would happen if we had 3 groups, only 2 of them were bonds, and 1 of them was a lone pair? So then we'd have something like this, where we have a lone pair, an electron cloud, there's an atom, there's another atom, and another atom. So now I still have the same electronic geometry. I have a trigonal planar electronic geometry. But the molecular shape is different. So imagine this where the lone pair of electrons is maybe the yellow balloon, and there's an atom here at the tip of the red, there's an atom in the center, and an atom here at the tip of the orange. So now we would have, once again, a bent geometry, but the bond angle would be different from our last bent geometry. So this would give us bent, and our bond angle it comes from the electronic geometry, but it would be slightly smushed. And so it's just slightly less than 120 degrees. And an example of this could be a molecule like that, where nitrogen is double bonded to a carbon and single bonded to a hydrogen, and then there's a lone pair. So that nitrogen has 3 groups around it. The double bond counts as 1 group, the single bond counts as 1 group, and the lone pair of electrons counts as the 3rd group. All right, so that pretty much takes care of any kind of molecular shape with 4 groups or 3 groups. Anytime you have 4 groups, you have a tetrahedral electronic geometry, and the shape really depends on how many bonds and lone pairs you have. Anytime you have 3 groups, you're going to have a trigonal planar electronic geometry, and the shape depends on how many groups are bonds and how many are lone pairs. And I'm going to talk about just one more, and that's in the case where you have only 2 groups around an atom. And so you have a central atom and 2 groups. I drew it like that because it is linear. So once again, I'm going to adjust my model. When I tie these 2 balloons to each other, you can see that they try to get as far apart from each other as possible, and they are in a linear arrangement. They're 180 degrees away from each other. So they're as far away as they can be from one another in space. And I'm only going to talk about the situation where both of these things are bonds. The bond angle in a linear molecule is 180 degrees. The electronic geometry is linear, and so is the molecular geometry. An example of this would be carbon dioxide. The atom in the center has 2 groups around it. It has this group, and they will be 180 degrees apart from each other. All right, make sure you understand this table. This is a really good way to think about molecular shape. And if you can simply remember the electronic geometry when you have 4, 3, or 2 groups, it's easy to remember the 3-dimensional shape or the bent shape here, and linear is pretty easy. Now I would like to show you a few molecular models that will help you understand the next page of your activity. So we'll just do a few of these to get you started. For carbon dioxide, the Lewis structure looks like this. I have a carbon double bonded to two oxygens, and each of the oxygens has two lone pairs. I've built a model of carbon dioxide. So this is just one way I can represent carbon dioxide using a three-dimensional structure. So here I have carbon as the black ball in the middle, and I have two oxygens on the outside. When I'm asked to talk about molecular shape of something like this, unless it's specified, you should assume that we're talking about the atom in the middle. So you can see that the bond angle here between this oxygen and this oxygen is 180 degrees. So this is a linear molecule with a 180-degree bond angle with respect to the central carbon. Now let me show you the structure, the Lewis structure for the next molecule that you're asked to draw, C2H4. There's the Lewis structure. Notice that the carbons have 4 bonds and each of the hydrogens has 1 bond, and the correct number of total electrons is right there. Here's a three-dimensional structure or a model that I've built of this particular molecule, which is ethane. So now in this one, when we're asking for the molecular shape of the carbon atoms, you could talk about either one of the carbon atoms. Notice that both carbon atoms are the same. Each one has 3 total groups. It has 2 hydrogens on each one, and it is also bound to a carbon. So, for example, this carbon is bound to 1, 2, 3 different things, and that makes the electronic geometry trigonal. And because it has the same number of bonds as groups, it's a trigonal planar molecule. So each one of these carbons is trigonal planar. Now let's draw the Lewis structure for CH4. It's really easy to deceive yourself and think that this is a flat molecule, but it's not. Remember, anything that has 4 groups around the central atom will have a tetrahedral electronic geometry, and when those 4 groups are bonds, the molecule will also have a tetrahedral geometry. Here's a model of CH4. The carbon is the central atom, and the 4 hydrogens are the white atoms attached. So notice that this is not flat. The bond angles here are 109 degrees. If it was flat, the bond angles would be 90 degrees, and they would have to be closer to one another. So this is the way that the atom arranges itself so that it can get those electron pairs in the atoms as far away from each other as possible. So that is a tetrahedral shape, and that's what you get with CH4. The Lewis structure for NH3 looks like this. Hopefully you can see here that once again we have 4 groups around the central atom. There's 1 lone pair and 3 bonded groups. Here's a model I built of this molecule, and I'm representing the lone pair with this little nubbin here. So the central atom is blue, it's the nitrogen, and the 3 hydrogens are the white balls here, or the white atoms. And notice that this is not completely flat, it's a trigonal pyramid. So think of the pyramids in Egypt if you have to, but there's like a trigonal base here, and then the central atom is at the peak of the pyramid. This molecule has bond angles of just less than 109.5 degrees. And last but not least, I'm going to do water. That's the Lewis structure for water. The oxygen has 2 lone pairs and 2 bonding groups for a total of 4 groups. Once again, we have a tetrahedral electronic geometry, but this time we have a bent molecular shape. Here's an example of a model that looks like water. This time I've represented my central oxygen with a green ball. My 2 lone pairs are represented by these little nubbins. Really, they would be, taking up space on either in either direction here, and that therefore this is a bent shape. So that's my model for water. The bond angles are less than 109 degrees because it has a tetrahedral electronic geometry and a bent molecular geometry. Please complete the activity on your own and check your key to make sure that you are correct. Thanks for watching this video on how to predict molecular shape using valence shell electron repulsion theory. If you have any questions, make sure you make office hours appointments or ask your friends. If you like this video, don't forget to vote.